My name is Lisa Anderson. I work on Resource Central's Slow the Flow program as the senior coordinator. I've been with the organization for about 2.5 years, starting out as a field technician and now in my current role doing operations and scheduling for our sprinkler evaluations. And Nika, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So my name is Nika Sunland, and I am the manager of the Slow the Flow program. So Lisa and I work side by side to manage that and run that program. And I have been with Resource Central for 9.5 years, primarily working on Slow the Flow. And just to give you a little more information about our program in general, our primary service is a sprinkler evaluation where we look at the efficiency of sprinkler systems. And we do about 3,000 of those at individual residences across the Front Range. And we do encourage anybody who's interested in that to sign up for our program, and we'll have more information about that throughout the presentation tonight.
All right. And thanks again for coming to our seminar tonight. The title of this one is Getting to Know Your Sprinkler System. This is meant to be for beginner level people who maybe you moved into a house with a sprinkler system and you've never maybe had sprinklers before. Maybe you're new to Colorado or a new homeowner, or you've had a sprinkler system for a long time and you just don't really know how it works. We're going to go over some of the basics today. So we're going to talk about basic knowledge, like just defining different terms of different parts of your sprinkler system, help you feel more empowered to make small changes to your system, whether that's to your schedule or to your the equipment within your system to make it run a little bit more efficiently. And the goal is to save water because we use about 55% of water outdoors, and that's primarily on grass. So it's very thirsty, and in order to save on your water bill and also to save water in our drought-ridden state, we want to try and save as much as possible. And as Taylor mentioned, this is the first seminar in a series of 3 on smart irrigation. The next one is on April 3rd. It's called Improving Your Sprinkler System. That one will be taught by Nika and myself as well. And it's more of an intermediate level where we're gonna talk about some DIY maintenance, a little bit more about drip irrigation and converting to drip from turf, and also some smart technology that you can use. And then on May 8th, we have a perennial garden irrigation seminar that is not taught by Resource Central staff. That will be by Joe Schneider of the Western State Reclamation. He's going to talk about different irrigation types for perennial gardens. All right. So the main topics we're going to go over today are sprinkler system components and terms. Again, just defining the different parts of your system so that you can get to learn it a little bit better. Simple adjustments that you can make to your sprinkler heads for the arc and radius, basically changing some of your spray patterns from your sprinkler heads. We're going to go over basic irrigation scheduling, so talking about best practices and how to use your system efficiently in terms of the schedule, so when and how to water. And then finally, we'll go over general information and tips. So first thing is the sprinkler system components and terms. This is a little infographic. This is from Hunter Industries, just to kind of give you an X-ray vision of what your overall system looks like. So we have some following slides that are going to go over everything in detail, but I'll just give you a brief overview of everything now. So starting in this bottom left-hand corner is your water meter, and that's where the city water supply connects to your home. Basically, there is a pipe and a meter that reads the flow of water into your yard in gallons, and that's how the city knows how much water you use and how much to bill you for. And next here, we have the backflow preventer, and that is basically a one-way valve that lets water into your yard but not back out, so you don't contaminate the city's water supply. Next along the line are valve boxes, which we have here in the center. And valves will open and close to let water into a specific irrigation zone. So you'll notice probably there's sections of your yard which are called either zones or stations. And that's a grouping of heads that come on all at once and then turn off at once. So these zone valves control the water flow in and out of a zone. On this slide, there's basically 3 zones. There's this one up top that's connected to this valve. This one on the side connected to this valve here, and then this last zone, which is a drip area, connected to that valve there. And then finally on this slide, we have the control clock, which is usually like in a garage or on the outside of your house, sometimes in the basement. And the controller clock is where you set the schedule so that your system knows when it needs to water and for how long. All right. So again, we're going to go over each of these in a little bit more detail. So the first thing is the backflow preventer. And this is usually kind of next to an exterior wall of your home, but it could be out in the middle of a yard like the photo on the right. It just depends on your specific yard's setup. And as I mentioned, it allows water to flow one way, basically from the city supply to your home, but not in reverse, because you don't want any water from your yard that might be contaminated to get back in the city water supply, since that's the water that we drink and cook with and bathe with. So we don't want any like pesticides or herbicides or anything like that getting in there. So this is the device that when you activate your system in the spring and blow it out in the fall, this is the device that's used to do that, basically. When it's open, you'll see there's these two valves here. And when they're parallel to the pipe, that means it's open. When they're perpendicular, that means it's closed. So if it was facing up and down, then it would be closed. This basically, just so you know, allows water to flow into your sprinkler system. Your sprinklers will not turn on if this device is not open. Okay, so let me see here. Next, I'm sorry about that little distraction there. In the next slide, we have the valve box here. This is just a little pit in your, I'm sorry, I have a little turn on reaction thing. I'm not sure how to get rid of that little speech bubble. I apologize for that being there. Anyway, so sorry, we'll have to have that distraction. I apologize. Anyway, so for the valve boxes, this is a little pit in the back of your yard. Usually, again, it's by the side of your house, but sometimes it's out in the middle of your yard. It just holds the valves. It's to protect it from dirt or debris, anything else that might clog up the valves. Usually you just might have one in your house, but depending on how many zones you have, you might have two or more. All right, so the valve box obviously holds the valves. It can only hold one, like the photo on the right, or multiple valves, like on the left. When it's a grouping of valves like this, it's called a manifold, and they're in one central location just to have it be an easy access point so that you don't have to go look for a valve for each zone if that valve was out near the actual zone. It's in one location, easy to get to, and so if you need to make any repairs, they're in one place. So every valve controls one zone or station of your yard. They are the heart of your system. Again, they will allow water to flow into a zone or not. So they open, they allow water to flow into a specific zone, the heads pop up, and it starts watering. When it closes, that water stops, and the heads go back down. It's a little hard to see from this photo in the left because it looks like they're all pink wires, but they're not. That's just the protective casing. But there are multiple wires down here that are different colors, and each color goes to a different valve. And I'll explain that a little bit more in the next slide. So your sprinkler controller is kind of the brain of your system. This is where you program in a schedule where you tell it when to water, like what days, what time to start, how long to water each zone. And as I mentioned before, there's wires that go to your valve, and those wires will open or close the valve using a little electrical signal. It might be a little hard to tell from the photo, but these are numbered. So this is zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, etc. And each of those individual wires connect to an individual valve to open or close it. So in case you're ever wondering what these funky little wires sticking out of the bottom of your control clock are, that's what they are, and that's what they do. As far as control clocks go, there are dozens, if not hundreds of different types. I'm going to go over 3 of the main types here. The first one is this top left-hand corner, which is the electromechanical clock. These are kind of the old-fashioned ones. They have pins and dials. There's not a lot of special features just because they're older versions. but they get the job done. They are functional. This wheel is run times, and then you have days and start times. The next one is an electrical control clock, which is what most people have. There's usually a combination of buttons and dials, and then there's a digital interface where you can read what each section is doing. So it shows you the runtime, shows you the date and time currently, all those different things. The last is a smart controller, and these are becoming more and more popular in recent days. You can see the interface is pretty plain, and that's because you put the schedule in on an app on your phone, and you control the schedule that way. And again, this leaves this pretty blank as far as functionality from the actual box that goes on the wall. All right. And as I mentioned before, valves will open to water a specific zone or station. Those terms are interchangeable. It just might depend on what your specific control clock calls them. So all of the zones within a zone, all the heads are connected through lateral lines, and those are usually just PVC pipe underground. They're usually about 8 to 12 inches buried underground. So when this first valve is turned on, it's going to turn on zone 1, and all the heads will pop up and spray at the same time. When that valve closes, then that zone turns off, all the heads pop back down. Then it moves on to zone 2. So valve number 2 opens up, zone 2 starts running, then it turns off, valve 3 opens up, and then zone 3 turns on. So, all right, so next is heads and nozzles, and this is kind of the smallest part of your sprinkler system. As I mentioned, the zone is a bunch of heads that are grouped together and connected through a lateral line, which is PVC pipe typically. Next, there's a swing joint, which is made of something called funny pipe, and that is more flexible. And the reason we want to have that is it allows us to move the head a few inches if we need to, so that it's not just stuck in one place. Also, it can take pressure. So if you hit the head with like a lawnmower or something, it can absorb that stress rather than a lateral line, which might crack, because we don't want our pipes to crack. So the flexibility of this is helpful for a couple different reasons. So then we have our head here. And when the system is turned off, it's going to be underground. You want the top of the head to be flush with the grass, because if it's taller than that, then you're probably going to hit it, trip over it, run it over with a mower, things like that. If it's too low, then it could get buried in dirt and not pop up when it's supposed to. You can't really see the nozzle in this picture because the head is down, but the nozzle is kind of in this top part here, and that's the part where the water actually comes out. So when you do turn a zone on, the water pressure basically forces this head up. It's spring-loaded, so it will pop up and then water will start to spray out. As I mentioned, the nozzle is where the actual water comes, and it determines the spray pattern. So whether that's like a 90-degree angle, 180 degree, determines how far it goes, all those sorts of factors. The reason it's important to know the difference between just a head overall and a nozzle is that often people think if something's wrong that they need to replace the whole head, when often you can just change out the nozzle. The nozzle is much easier and cheaper to replace than the entire head. You'd only want to replace the head if it's like leaking out of the bottom or just major geysers are happening when you're turning on your system. But in most cases, you can just swap out, the nozzle. All right, and as we talk about sprinkler heads, there are a couple different types, and it's important to know the difference between them. So we'll start our little video here. So rotor heads and spray heads are the two main types of sprinkler heads. And a good way to kind of remember the difference is that spray heads are stationary and rotor heads rotate. Unfortunately, my spray head stopped spraying there, but you can see it just pops up and sprays in one direction in kind of a fan-like pattern, whereas the rotor glides back and forth. And rotor heads usually cover larger areas like a backyard or a football field, whereas spray heads are more for like front yards or side strips, which is that strip of grass between your sidewalk and the road that's only a few feet wide, or irregularly shaped areas, those sorts of things. So within kind of the category of rotor heads, there are two different types. And you have examples. So as you can see, impact rotors are much bigger and gear-driven rotors are much smaller. They both do rotate, some rotors, but you can see the gear-driven on the left-hand side is much more of a smooth back and forth pattern, whereas the impact rotor is much more of that kind of standard sprinkler noise and pattern we're familiar with, where it goes like so impact rotors are, I guess, a little bit more old-fashioned, but they are good about covering larger areas. So if you have a really, really big area, impact rotors can usually cover further out. One thing to know about a difference between the two is that you do not need a special tool to adjust an impact rotor. You can just use your fingers. Whereas a gear-driven rotor, you need either a screwdriver or something called a hunter key. And Nika will talk about this in her section when she talks about adjustments. So yes, okay. Next, we're just going to talk about the nozzles that are associated with the different types of rotors. So you can see for the gear-driven rotor, the nozzle is kind of embedded in the top of the head. It's that red part in the bottom left-hand picture, and it is held in place by what's called a set screw. So that's that screw that's kind of pointing straight down. To change it out, basically you unscrew the screw, pop it out with your finger or a screwdriver, pop a new one in, screw that set screw back in. It may be a little difficult to see on this picture, but right here, there's a number. It says 2.0, and that indicates the flow rate. So that is how many gallons per minute that this particular nozzle will put out. Different nozzles do put out different rates. So you can tell by the number. Again, on this blue one, it's probably also a little difficult to see, but it says 3.0 right here. Different color nozzles can indicate that it's a different type, meaning maybe the angle that the water comes out at. On this blue one, it says L and A for low angle. So that one is more of like a straight out pattern, whereas a standard nozzle does more of a rainbow arch kind of spray pattern. So that's basically just know that different colors have a different type of spray pattern. Then here on this impact rotor, you can see the shape of the nozzle is a little bit different, but kind of the same principles. Different colors mean a different spray pattern. It also has a little thing right here, this little needle, and that needle can block the path of the water, which will affect the radius, which again, Nika will talk about when we talk about how to make adjustments. Okay, and now we're going to go back to spray heads. If you remember what I said, spray heads are stationary, but the stationary portion only refers to the actual head. The nozzles can either be a standard nozzle, which is stationary, or a rotary nozzle, which spins. So I know that might be a little bit confusing, but basically the head itself stays in place where the nozzle on top, where the water actually comes out, spins. And the difference between these is you can kind of see, for the standard nozzle, it's this little fan shape of water that's pretty uniform. Whereas the rotary nozzle, which is also called a high efficiency nozzle, has more of these little streaks of water that come out. I always call it the octopus arm nozzle. So something to know about these two types of nozzles. Standard nozzles put out a lot of water compared to rotary nozzles. In fact, they put out about 3 to 6 times more water per hour than rotary nozzles. And this can be a little confusing for some people because, like I said, rotary nozzles are also known as high efficiency. And people think, well, high efficiency, doesn't that mean it should be done faster? And in this case, it's not the speed that it works at, but how well it actually waters. We have clay soil out here in Colorado and it absorbs water very slowly. So you actually want something that's going to water slower so that you lose less to runoff and evaporation and other factors. Okay. And for spray heads, usually the body is the same size. For most brands, that means that the nozzle is interchangeable. And I actually have one here. So the nozzle is just this little top part. As you can see in the diagram, it's between the two red lines, and it just unscrews. So that pops right off. And if you want to change it to the high efficiency rotary, you can just screw that on. So that's going to be for most brands. Of course, there's some brands that are not going to be compatible. There's some that where the nozzle is actually incorporated into the stem portion, so you can't remove the nozzle. But for the most part, you can change out any nozzle that's a standard nozzle with a high efficiency or vice versa. A few differences that aren't really that big of a deal. As you can see here on the standard nozzle, the filter is separate from the actual nozzle, and the filter is just to make sure that dirt and debris don't get into the actual nozzle. Whereas on the high efficiency, it's one piece, it's incorporated. It's not necessarily better or worse, just something to be aware of. And we won't get into this too much, but again, different colors usually indicate differences in the nozzles. In this case, it's the radius, meaning how far out the water shoots. Right, so again, just to give a summary of the different head and nozzle types, we have our rotor heads, which move back and forth. They have an intermediate precipitation rate, meaning how many inches per hour of water they put out. And they are better for bigger areas. They can shoot further and have a more concentrated stream rather than a fan out kind of effect. And then for spray heads, we have a standard nozzle and a rotary nozzle, and they put out water at very different rates. So one thing to keep in mind with that too is if you're wanting to say convert to the high efficiency nozzles, you're going to need to change out the entire zone, because if half the zone has standard nozzles and half has the high efficiency, they're going to water at very different rates. So you're going to get some very patchy looking grass and a lot of brown spots potentially. So we do have this little box at the bottom here, just to, as a reminder of precipitation rate, which again is how much water per hour that nozzles and heads put out. The standard spray nozzle puts out the most, which is 1 to 1.5 inches per hour. Rotors put out an intermediate amount, which is about 1/2 to 1 inch of water per hour. And then the rotary nozzles put out the least amount of water, which is about 1/4 to 1/2 an inch per hour. All right, and we're going to talk about drip irrigation just briefly. In our second presentation in April, we'll go into drip in more detail. So this is just going to be very basic, but we did want to at least introduce the concept of the different types of drip irrigation. So drip is meant to be used for basically anything that's not turf in your yard. So shrubs, flowers, veggies, trees. You want to use it because it uses 30 to 50% less water than just using sprinklers. And in most cases, it will deposit water at the root zone directly where it needs to go. For example, in this photo, we don't really need to be watering this mulch because mulch doesn't need water. We just need to water the plants. So it helps target where the water goes a little bit better. In this example, you can see there's a main line here, and then these little spaghetti lines that go off to each individual plant. But there are multiple types of drip, which actually we will go over in the next slide here. So first type we'll talk about here is the soaker hose. And that is basically a hose that has hundreds of little teeny tiny holes in it that kind of just weep out water. So if you use this, you would kind of weave it in and out of a segment and water would just flow out through the whole thing. So this would be good for densely planted areas or areas where there's a lot of roots, like maybe you have some shrubs where there's roots everywhere. This will do a little bit of water over a large space. Next, we have the inline drip, and that's just going to be basically like a mainline tube that has holes punctured in it every so often. It's about every like 9 to 24 inches, it'll have a hole. That's good for things like rows of vegetable gardens when you have evenly spaced plants in a row. Then down here, we have button emitters, and these are attached to a spaghetti line. In this case, it is at the end of a spaghetti line, and in this case, it is between the main line and the spaghetti line. Both are fine to do. There's not a right or wrong way to do it. It's just kind of your preference on where you would prefer the actual emitter to go. And what the emitter does is that these are rated, unlike sprinklers, which are gallons per minute, these are gallons per hour and it will drip water at a specific rate. So it can be like half a gallon per hour, 1 gallon, 2 gallon, that sort of thing. And lastly, we have micro sprays, which, as you can probably tell, is just a little mini sprinkler. And this would be good for areas of like densely packed flowers or maybe trees. It's probably self-explanatory, but it does put out more water than these other types of drip, which are more of a traditional actual drip, whereas this is more of a spray. And the last thing we'll touch on in this segment is hydrozones. So hydrozones aren't quite the same as an irrigation zone. A hydrozone basically just means you want to group plants with similar water needs together. So when you have flowers, you're planting flowers in the same area. When you have veggies, you're planting those in the same area. And ideally, it should be one irrigation zone per hydrozone. And that doesn't always happen. I've gone to people's homes where they have, say, zone 1 is half grass and half flowers. And the issue with that is they have very different watering needs. So if you're watering it to meet the needs of the grass, then you're probably overwatering the flowers. And if you're watering to meet the needs of the flowers, then you're underwatering the grass. So in a perfect world, you're going to have it where each there's one hydrozone per irrigation zone. All right, so we'll take about a 10 to 15-minute question break, and we're happy to answer any questions you have about the different parts of your system.
Yeah, so feel free to get those questions into the Q&A. Let's go ahead and start with this first question. Someone was wondering about changing out the nozzles. Do they need to be within the same brand, or can they be different brands?
That's a good question. So not necessarily. Again, we can't speak to like every single brand, but the main brands like Hunter and Rainbird and Orbit usually are interchangeable. One that is not is Toro. Toro has a different thread type than the other brands. So if you have Toro heads, you will need to use, you can only replace with Toro nozzles, and yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And then should emitters be above the mulch, below the mulch, in line with the gravel, below gravel?
That's good too. And I'd say that's more personal preference. I'd say, there's pros and cons. When they're above the mulch, they're more likely to get damaged. But you can see them. So some people don't always like when they're buried because you don't necessarily know what they're doing, and you don't know if they get damaged because you can't really see it. Might also depend on the type of plant and all that. If it was just personal preference, I'd say maybe put a little bit on top. But again, I don't necessarily believe there's a right or wrong way with that. Would you say that's accurate, Nika?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would recommend for your main line and your spaghetti lines, putting that under your mulch, just because you're less likely to trip on it if you're walking through there. Also, it'll be more protected because that is polytube. It's not rigid. It does have some flexibility to it, so it is more likely to tear or break if you step on it. And so I would recommend putting that under the mulch. But yeah, your individual emitters, especially if you have like a button emitter, that's going to be very close to the base of the plant. And so that one is not really it. To Lisa's point, it doesn't really matter if you bury it under the mulch or not, as long as it is at the base of the plant. Whereas a soaker hose, I would recommend putting that under the mulch. They just kind of weep. And so especially if you have a thick layer of mulch, which is ideal, it could take a lot for that to actually soak through the mulch. So I would do something like a soaker hose or inline underneath the mulch for sure. Great question.
Great, thank you. Kind of similar to that, not talking about the emitters, but it sounds like someone has a joint or funny line that might be pushing up by a tree root that's above the surface now, but the head's still functioning. So does that sound like it would be an issue or really just a visual concern?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that
Go ahead,
oh,
Nika.
Lisa. Okay, yeah. So that's a great question, Anna. I do wonder, since you said you have an exposed funny line, that seems very unusual to me. And if your funny line was exposed, I would think the head would also be very out of whack. So I'm curious to know if you have a drip line and maybe it's actually the polytube from the drip that you're seeing that's actually not attached to that head. Because if that head appears to be in the ground and looks normal, it's probably not your funny pipe that's exposed unless it's like a hole and you're seeing. But if you don't see any obvious signs of leaks, like you don't see any pooling in the general area, and if the rest of your sprinklers pop up normally and everything seems to work fine, so you don't appear to have any pressure issues, then you probably don't have any breaks. And then it is more of an aesthetic thing. And then just again, keeping in mind that that is more likely to be damaged. So just be careful with your lawnmower in that area or your weed eater, just to make sure you don't damage it. But it's not immediate cause for concern if a pipe is exposed, if that's the question.
Great. Kind of touching on like pressure. Um, Someone has a drip line that doesn't seem to get enough pressure to where they want it to go. Any suggestions?
Mhm. It could be just the length of the main line of drip or how many spaghetti lines you have going off of it. It's hard when the issue is low pressure, because when you have high pressure, you can do a pressure regulator or things like that. When you have low pressure, there's not really a lot of options other than maybe just making it, like I said, a shorter drip line. The other option you could potentially try, depending on when this person is watering, you might have better water pressure at a time when other people are not watering. So that's part of why we water at night, is people aren't, usually running their dishwashers and laundry and all that. So maybe even just changing the time of when you water could potentially help. Yeah, any other thoughts on that, Nika?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Lisa just mentioned. One thing that you could also do, so drip needs to run at a more precise pressure than your sprinkler heads do. So most drip likes to run at like around 25 to 30 PSI. So most of us have a higher pressure than that. So we actually have to put a pressure reducer at kind of the beginning of that drip line. So that likely would be associated with the valve in the valve box. So if when that drip line was installed, if somebody put a lower pressure regulator, like a 15 PSI or something, that certainly could be the cause of your pressure issue. So I would look into that, just see what the rating, it should say right on the pressure reducer what the PSI is. And then just to emphasize, I don't know how long your line is or how many emitters or micro sprays you have coming off of it, but there is a finite amount that you can have running off of that and still maintain that pressure. Or if you're using soaker hose, I've actually experienced this personally. If you have a pretty long run of soaker hose, the amount of water that comes out at the end is going to be drastically different than the amount that comes out at the beginning. That can also happen with other types of emitters too, if they're not pressure regulated. So if you have non-pressure regulated emitters, the ones that are closer to the source are going to put out more water than the ones at the end. So there's a few things that you could look at there.
Yeah, lots of things to trial and error there and see what ends up being the issue. Someone has a question about zones. How do you know how many zones you have in your yard?
So a good way to tell is to see how many basically are wired in your clock. Of course, they are electrical wires, so don't touch them. But usually there's an area that you can pull up and you can just see how many are there. The other thing is you can try to do just a manual run to do like a visual inspection and to see how many pop up.
You can also locate your valve boxes if you know where those are in your yard. Lisa did some slides on that earlier, and just look and see how many valves you see. Because remember, again, one valve equals one zone. So if you open your valve boxes and you see 8 valves, then at least at one point you had 8 zones. But otherwise, honestly, like what Lisa suggested is the quickest and easiest way is just to pop open that little panel on your control clock and see how many zones are wired.
And is there an easy way, another question, to tell within your box which valve goes to which zone if they're not labeled?
No.
Yeah,
Mm.
there are colors. So, but as you saw probably, let me go back actually. Find the right slide here. So you can see in this one, there are different colors, but there's also 2 yellows and 2 greens. So, the yellow wire is there's going to be 2 valves that have yellow wires and 2 zones that have yellow wires. So in this case, you can narrow it down to 2, but you're not going to know exactly. But yeah, the color wire does correspond to what goes into the valve. And again, like this last photo isn't the best for showing it because they look like they're all pink, but they're not. Very in this little corner here, you can sort of see there's like a yellow and a green, and those correspond to the valve. So sometimes it just has to be trial and error, but that's kind of the best way to know.
Okay, awesome. All right, let's see. We've got lots of great questions here. Question about irrigation for trees. Is there a specific type of irrigation that you would recommend for large trees?
Mhm. So it depends. If the tree's like in the middle of your yard, usually the regular sprinklers can adequately handle that as long as you're watering for long enough. Some people do drip on trees, and I'll say you can, but you have to run it for a really, really long time or have several emitters around it. With trees, also, you don't want to water like necessarily right next to the base, but out near the drip line of the tree. That's basically where the crown of the tree, like if you were to draw parallel lines down from the crown to the ground, kind of you want to water in that area. So I'll be honest, I just use, especially in the winter, a bucket. But there's like needles you can use that you stick into the ground and they will water. You can use bubblers. There's lots of different types of watering. But like I said, in the summer, you can probably just use your regular sprinklers as long as, assuming that tree is in the zone that has sprinklers, water it. And you can use buckets in the winter or just a regular hose.
Yeah, great. Okay. Let's see here. We've got a question about how do you tell what size nozzles and fittings you'll need or whether adapters are needed?
Mhm. I would say look at the brand of your head. And I know sometimes they're old and maybe you can't tell. um, but as far as the size of the nozzles, again, for sprays, it's a pretty standard size. The only thing you need to know for the size is the radius, and basically measure the distance from one head to the next head, and that's how much you need. So if it's 6 feet between your heads, you're going to need a 6-foot nozzle. And they're, like I said, they're color coded. You can go on like the website or just look at Home Depot and see which color corresponds to which radius. And Nika's going to touch on this more in the next section when she talks about arc and radius, but there's different shapes. Like in a corner, you're going to want a 90-degree angle. On the side of your yard, you want a 180-degree angle. But there's usually not an adapter you'll need as long as you're getting the right brand and so I'd look at the make and model and then just get the corresponding, nozzle type.
Great. Okay. I think we'll have time for one more question for this question break and then we'll
Yep.
continue on. But don't worry, everyone, we'll have another question break later.
Taylor, I actually saw a question that I think is a great one that I'd like to address.
Go for
So
it.
the one that somebody asked, can you use microspray drip system for grass turf? So you technically can, but you do not want to. Because as Lisa mentioned, a lot of those nozzles for sprinkler heads are rated in gallons per minute, whereas drip is rated in gallons per hour. So your sprinklers are putting out about 60 times as much water as your drip system. And it's over a much larger area. So you really don't want to water your grass with drip. Now, I will say there is a type of you could almost it's similar to drip. It's called subsurface irrigation that some people use to water their turf, but that is typically installed prior to the sod being laid. It's basically like a thin layer that goes underneath and it's right at the root system. Again, that's not something you can really go back and install, and that's extremely rare, especially for residential purposes. So drip of any kind is for non-turf, and then your standard rotors and spray heads, sprinklers, are for turf. That's really what they are intended for. So that's the best way to water.
Great. Awesome. All right. Well, we'll continue on with the presentation, but keep getting those questions in. We'll have a chance to answer them again later.
Fantastic. All right, so my turn. So Lisa, thank you for starting us off. So now that Lisa has taught us how to speak sprinkler and taught us those important parts, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to make some very simple adjustments that can significantly affect the performance of your sprinklers. Okay, so first let's talk about, Lisa, go ahead and advance that slide for me, please. Great, thank you. When to adjust. So these are mostly pretty self-explanatory, but if you do have some dry areas, you see an area of your yard that looks like it's getting no water or much less water than the rest of them, you may not be getting good coverage. And then the opposite of that is if you have what we call overspray, which is putting water where it doesn't belong. So some classic examples of that we have pictures of here. One is that fence where you get that very distinct discoloration. That means your sprinklers are hitting your fence a lot. And then we've probably all seen this in our neighborhoods of seeing that water on the streets, sidewalk, driveways. And I promise you, no matter how much you water the concrete, it doesn't grow. So we want to try and eliminate that as much as we can. So let's talk about how to do that. All right, so first of all, understanding what's going on. So usually when you have overspray or you're not covering where you want to, it's going to be a result of one or two of these issues. So the radius and arc, which Lisa has touched on a little bit. So the radius is how far an individual sprinkler head throws water from its point, okay? And that's measured in feet. So 5 feet, 10 feet, 50 feet in the case of some larger rotors. And you can imagine if it's spraying too far, that's when you get that overspray. And if it's not spraying far enough, that's when you get that poor coverage. All right. The partner of the radius is the arc. So the arc is the shape of the spray pattern that the sprinkler is emitting. So I like to call it the piece of the pie. Is it a narrow piece? Is it a big piece? And on this slide, we have some examples of kind of some standard arcs. So 90 degree, 180, and 360. So a 90-degree arc would be good to have in the corner of your yard. 180 would be good to have along your driveway or your sidewalk. And then a 360 would be kind of in the middle of the yard. All right. So again, if that spray pattern is too big, you'll get overspray. And if it's too small, you're not going to get the coverage that you want. All right, so first we're going to talk about how to adjust rotors, and we're going to focus first on the gear-driven rotors because those and the impacts are a little bit different. So please keep in mind that the particular details of the adjustments does vary by make and model. So you will need to determine what the make and model of your individual sprinklers are to be able to know exactly how to adjust them. But here I'm going to focus on two of the most common. So on the left, we have a Rainbird rotor, and on the right is a Hunter. So Rainbird and Hunter are kind of like the Ford and Chevy of sprinklers, okay? So let's look at the Rainbird on the left, and in that red circle is the area where you're going to adjust the radius. So again, that's how far it's throwing. So for the Rainbird, you basically just need a very small flathead screwdriver, which that green tool in the middle there is actually called a Rainbird tool, and it is used to adjust Rainbird heads. So you can get one, but you don't have to have one to do this. But to adjust your radius, you just stick the flathead screwdriver down into that hole and engage the screw. And then if you are spraying too far and you want to reduce the radius, you'll actually dial that screw down by turning it clockwise. So what you're doing is physically putting that screw more into the path of the flow of water, and it will stop it from going as far. Conversely, if you want to extend the radius, you back it out counterclockwise. Now, one thing to keep in mind with rotors when you're adjusting that radius, that screw is called a set screw, and its primary function is to physically hold the nozzle in the head. And if you back that screw out too much while you're extending your radius, you can basically blow the nozzle out of the head. It literally will go flying out, and usually you lose your screw too. So you want to be careful. Do this while the sprinkler is running and be peeking around the front and keep an eye on that screw to make sure you're not backing it out too far. Okay. So as far as adjusting the arc or the path of travel, so remember the rotor rotates, so the left to right path of travel makes up your arc. One thing that is really important to know with rotors, these gear-driven rotors have what's known as a hard stop side on one side of the path of travel, and then the other side is actually adjustable. And that hard stop side, guess what? It varies by brand. So on Rainbirds, that hard stop side is the left, and on Hunters, the hard stop side is the right. Don't know why they did it, but just to confuse us all, I think. So you will be able, with this technique, to be able to adjust one side only of that path of travel. The idea is that that hard stop side was put in the correct position when the head was installed. If it wasn't and you have to change that, we're not going to focus on that in this presentation, but we will touch on that more in our next presentation next month. But let's talk about these simple ones first. So you'll just take that flathead screwdriver, stick it in that hole that we have circled in yellow. And you can see there's a plus and a minus there. You turn that towards the plus sign to increase your arc, so to have a bigger left to right pattern, or the minus sign towards that if you want to decrease your arc. So that's on the Rainbird. Very similar process on the Hunter, just slightly different layout and a different tool. The Hunter, it's really important to have the Hunter tool. You can do it without it, but it's a lot easier to have their specific tool. So the lower end of that tool is actually a very small Allen head, and that is what you use to adjust the radius in that red circle there on the right. So exact same thing as on the Rainbird. You go clockwise to go drive that screw down to decrease your radius, and back that out counterclockwise to increase your radius. And then to adjust your arc, you use the other end of the tool that Lisa's circling there for us, stick it in where that yellow circle is, and same concept, you turn towards the plus sign to increase your arc, the minus sign to decrease your arc. Okay, so I know that's a little quick and dirty. There are tons of videos online specific to the make and model of sprinklers. So I encourage you to look up your specific sprinklers and watch some videos. It's not nearly as hard as what it might sound like once you get used to it. All right, so impact rotors, much easier in my opinion. So to adjust the radius, we have a picture there on the left. In that red circle, there is actually, usually on those, it's a plastic screw, and you can just adjust it with your hands. So if you want to, again, decrease your radius, drive the screw in to impede the path of the water. You want to increase your radius, back it out. And then for your arc or path of travel, there is no hard stop on these. This is great. Okay, so you can actually have kind of on the opposite side of that stem, of the opposite side of the nozzle, is you have this little tail. And Lisa, could you possibly circle that tail for us? There's the nozzle. So over on the other picture. Yep. Yep, there, it's in there. So there's your tail. And then that tail is this, there we go. As it goes back and forth, will interact with the tabs on there. There's basically these two springs that have these tabs on them. And that tail, as it goes back and forth, hits the tabs that send it the opposite direction. So if you want to change your arc or path of travel, you literally just take those tabs and adjust that around. And again, there's no hard stop. It's much easier to adjust that. All right, so that's rotors. So now we'll talk about spray heads. So similarly to the gear-driven rotors, the nozzles for spray heads will they'll have a hard stop side if they are adjustable. So there are some spray nozzles that are known as fixed arc nozzles. So you cannot adjust the degree. You can aim it in different directions, but for example, a fixed 90-degree arc nozzle is always going to be 90 degrees. And again, you don't need to have all of them be adjustable, but there are certain instances where adjustables are nice. Certainly if it's not a standard 90, 180, 360, things like that. So first you want to determine which side of your adjustable nozzle is the hard stop side. And you can do that just by trying to adjust it. And depending on the make and model, the adjustment is going to be a slightly different technique. Sometimes it's a little collar, which is very close to where the nozzle attaches to the stem. Other times it's literally going to be the top of the nozzle itself, which is what the example in this picture is showing. So determine which side is your hard stop. That is the side you want to line up first with where you want it to be. So a great example of that is if it's along a sidewalk, you want that hard stop side to be parallel to the sidewalk. And the way you do that is in this first picture on the left, while the head is running, you're going to just grab that stem and you're going to turn it. You're going to ratchet it. You'll actually hear it and feel it kind of clicking. and you'll line up that hard stop side where you want it to be. Once that is correct, then you will adjust your arc to fit the space that you are trying to water. So if you need a 120-degree arc, you can open it up. You can bring it down if you need smaller. So that is what you do to get the direction and the arc the correct way on your spray heads. Then for your radius, there's another screw, and it's on top of the nozzle on these. And most of them take a teeny tiny flathead screwdriver. And same thing, if you want to reduce your radius, go clockwise down. You want to increase your radius, go counterclockwise out. These you don't have to worry about something flying off if you back the screw out too much. Just know that with all of these, there is a minimum and maximum radius. So it's not, you can't bring those down to like a 6-inch radius. Most of them are at least, are at a minimum like 4 or 5 feet for spray heads. And conversely, there is a maximum depending on the nozzle. So that's some basic adjustments. So that can fix or at least improve a lot of your coverage issues. Just know that there may be times where the incorrect nozzle is just installed. It's a fixed nozzle and it really needs to be adjustable or vice versa. So it is something to keep in mind, but this is a really good place to start to make adjustments. All right, so now that we've talked about how to adjust your sprinklers, we're going to talk about how to program them to run. All right, and changing your watering schedule is one of the most important things that you can do, and it's also one of the easiest, and it's completely free. So Lisa, go ahead, move to the next slide. Thank you. All right, so here is one example of a control clock. Lisa already talked about these and that there are dozens of them. They all have different knobs and dials and readouts, but they all do the exact same thing. They turn your sprinklers on at a certain time for a certain amount of time. So once you understand the basic elements of a watering schedule in your clock, it's pretty easy to use most control clocks. Okay, so the most important things to know is the 3 things that you have to program in there for your sprinklers to run. So you need watering days. So that's going to be days of the week, Tuesdays and Fridays, for example. Some control clocks also have the ability to do what's called a watering interval. So every other day, every 4th day, something like that. Most of the time, you're going to do specific days. Second is your run times. So that is going to be specific for each zone. So that is how many minutes each zone runs. 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 55 minutes, whatever you need that zone to run. And then you have your start times. So that is the time of day that you want your sprinklers to run. So 4 a.m., 8 p.m., something like that. And then almost all control clocks have the ability to do multiple start times or cycles. And we're going to talk more about cycles in this section of the presentation, because it's very important to be able to do what we call cycle and soak. And we'll get into that more next. All right, so just some good practices when you're planning out your sprinkler schedule. So these days, most water providers or municipalities have watering restrictions. So it's very important that you look those up for your location. So know who your water provider is, where you're getting your water, see if they have any watering restrictions. Some water providers are very strict and will fine you if you do not adhere. Others aren't quite as strict. They just give you some guidelines and ask you to comply. But in a lot of areas these days, you can only water on certain days of the week, and that is often based on your address. So some cities around here are doing it where if you have an even numbered address, so your street address on your house ends in an even number, you can water on, say, Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, no other days. And if you have an odd numbered address, then you can water on Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays. That's just an example. Please check with your water provider to see what your specific restrictions are. Just be aware that a lot of them are going that route, okay? Then they also will give you guidelines on what time of day you can water. So pretty much across the board, none of them want you to water between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. So just don't water during the day. Okay, be done watering by 10 in the morning and don't start watering until after 6 p.m. So my good rule of thumb is, so that you don't have to memorize times, is when the sun is down. Just water when the sun is down and you're good. Okay. Another really good rule, is to adjust your schedule throughout the watering season. So when you first turn on your system in the spring, you're probably going to water 1 day a week, maybe 2 days a week. Whereas when we get into the heat of the summer, you're going to be watering 3 days a week. So it is perfectly normal and actually correct and proper to adjust the number of watering days per week throughout the season. Now, keep in mind, you don't want to water more than 3 days a week for your grass. Okay, unless it's brand new sod that you just planted, no, don't do more than 3 days per week. It's actually not beneficial for your grass to do that. You should be watering deeper, less frequently than watering, say, every day. Also, most water providers limit you to 3 days per week maximum. Some actually limit you to 2 days per week. So make sure you know your restrictions, but pretty much across the board, no more than 3 days per week. Another thing you can adjust throughout the season is the run times of your individual zones. So certainly your zones that get a lot of sun in the heat of the summer, they may need a little more water. And so you can up the number of minutes those run when they do. And you don't have to do that across the board, because if you have a shady zone, it may not need more water. Whereas again, the ones that are getting blasted by the sun, you might want to tweak a little bit. And then I already mentioned this, and you're going to hear me talk about it again, cycle and soak. So the reason we do this is because of our clay soil. So most of us here on the Front Range have clay soil, which gets a bad rap because it's really hard to dig in, but it is really good at holding onto water. It's just not good at absorbing a whole lot of water at one time. It saturates fairly quickly. So if you water one time for a really long amount of time, you get what we call runoff, where the soil will saturate and any additional water you put on there will just pool and then it'll run off. It'll literally slide down the soil onto the street or the sidewalk, and you're not getting any benefit from that water. It's just literally wasted. So if we do multiple cycles for shorter amounts of time, we can still apply the same amount of water overall, but we're actually going to get it to absorb into the soil. So it's very important to do that for your turf zones. All right, so we get asked all the time, how long to water? And guess what? It depends. So it's going to depend on what head types you have, how much water pressure you have, what your head spacing is, and what the water needs of the vegetation are. So every zone is a little bit different, but here's some good general ranges if you have no idea where to start. So if you have spray heads with those standard nozzles, usually 20 to 30 minutes per day will do it, watering day, not day of the week. Rotors, 30 to 60 minutes per watering day. And then for those rotary nozzles, because they have a very low precipitation rate, you usually need to run them 75 to 150 minutes per watering day. Okay. Again, those are just good ballparks, places to start. Now for your drip, same thing. It varies a lot depending on the specific plant needs. So if you have a xeric plant or something that's a cactus, it needs little to no water. Whereas if you plant a tropical plant, it's going to need a whole bunch of water. It also depends on the type of drip you're using. So again, those soaker hoses have a lower application rate than a micro spray or a button emitter that you might, be applying 3 gallons per hour. So you need to understand what type of drip you have and how fast water's coming out of it, and then also the needs of your plants. But again, just to get you started, start low and then adjust as needed. So if you currently have a drip system and then you've been using it and it's already has a program for it, if your plants look good and you want to see if you can save a little bit of water, you can reduce your minutes a little bit and see how your plants react. It's a little bit of trial and error. And if your plants look a little peaked when you do that, bump it back up. Conversely, if your plants look a little peaked, you can try increasing. You want to find that sweet spot, right? Where they look like they're just happy enough. But you will have to kind of play with it a little bit. And then another thing to keep in mind is it is perfectly okay for your grass to not look like a golf course. So that's one of the biggest misconceptions. is when people see their grass start to go brown in the summer, they think it's dying. And for most of us, that is not correct. So most of us have Kentucky bluegrass, which is a cool season grass, meaning it is happy and green in the summer and the fall when it's cooler. And its normal life cycle is to go dormant in the heat of the summer and go brown. So your grass isn't dying, it's just doing its normal life cycle, okay? We keep it green by artificially overwatering the heck out of it. So when you see somebody who has that lush green yard, they're probably overwatering. And we want to let that grass go through its natural life cycle just for its sake. And then also it saves us a heck of a lot of water. All right, so now let's do an example schedule. So on this schedule, I've picked Tuesdays and Fridays as my watering days. I have 3 zones that run for 7, 25, and 10 minutes respectively. And I have picked 3 start times to do my cycle and soak of 3 a.m., 5 a.m., and 7 a.m. So what this means is that on Tuesday at 3 a.m., zone 1 will come on and run for 7 minutes because that's how long it is scheduled to run. So at 3:07, zone 1 shuts off and zone 2 immediately comes on and it runs for its 25 minutes, shuts off. Zone 3 immediately comes on, runs for its 10 minutes. So in this case, our entire cycle is 42 minutes because that's the sum of the 3 run times. So one cycle is 1 run of each zone that is programmed. So now from 3:42 to 5 a.m. when my next cycle starts, the system rests. So that's the soak part of the cycle and soak. And that allows all the water we applied in that first cycle to absorb into the clay soil. And then at 5 a.m., the exact same thing happens, where those zones come on one at a time in consecutive order for the number of minutes they're programmed to run. And then same thing happens with our third cycle. So for this example, on both Tuesdays and Fridays, our first watering will start at 3 a.m. and our last watering ends at 7:42 with a couple of breaks in there for soaking. So that's a great example of a cycle and soak schedule. All right, so now just some other good information and some tips. So you do need to turn your sprinkler system on and off for the seasons, and it's not just at the control clock. So in the spring, once it stops freezing, you're going to activate or turn on the system. So historically around here, that's after Mother's Day, although with climate change, that might be shifting a little bit. So just look at your area, see when it looks like it's going to stop freezing, and then you can look into activating your system. So basically all that is you're allowing the water back into the backflow preventer, the lateral lines, and the heads. And so that the water is turned back on, your backflow preventer is opened, and then your sprinklers are going to work. So the flip side of that is winterizing it or blowing out your sprinklers. So you're going to do that in the fall before it starts to freeze. Because if you don't do this and you let that water stay in those lateral lines and heads and backflow preventer over the winter, they're more than likely going to burst because the water inside there is going to freeze and expand. So you definitely want to do this. So you will basically shut off the water to the system, and then compressed air is used by hooking it up to the backflow preventer to literally blow out any residual water in those lines and heads. So this can be a little intimidating, especially if you've never done it. There are a lot of videos online. If you feel comfortable doing that, certainly give it a shot. Or you can hire a professional. So that is not something that we at Resource Central do, but there are a ton of companies out there that do that. Something to keep in mind is there's going to be a lot of people wanting the service at the same time. So try to look ahead, see when you anticipate wanting to shut off or turn on your system, and try to get that booked because those typically go pretty fast, those appointments. All right, just some other good things to know, especially if you're new to a sprinkler system. So we highly recommend having a manual for your controller. So you may know how to use your control clock, but if it's been, you shut it off for the winter, you come back to it in the spring, it might be like, oh man, I can't remember how to do X, Y, or Z. So we always recommend having a manual. If you don't have one, you bought the house and there wasn't one when you bought the house, no big deal. These days, almost all manuals are available online. So just look up the make and model of your clock. You can almost always find a PDF version that you can download. Another good thing to have is a copy of your watering schedule. So even if you just literally write it down on a piece of paper, I've seen people do that and then they tape it next to the clock on the wall. Certainly you want to do that to kind of have your baseline schedule, especially to start your season. Excuse me. As you make changes, I would make note of that as well. And one reason it's a really good idea to keep a copy of your schedule is if your clock basically blinks out, which can happen if you lose power, which goes along with my next bullet of having a battery backup in your clock. So not all clocks have this, but a lot of them do. You can actually have a battery in there. A lot of times it's a 9 volt, although it can vary. And what that battery does, it will not run your sprinklers if the power is out, but it will store your schedule. So even if you lose power and your clock goes out, your sprinklers aren't going to work, but your program schedule will be safe in your clock. Whereas if you don't have that battery backup, a lot of clocks will dump your schedule and then you're having to recreate it, which is why it's good to have a copy. All right. It is good to note too, some clocks, even if they have a battery backup, they will not keep the time when they lose power. So, you know, in your house, when your power comes back on and your microwave is flashing 12 o'clock, your control clock might do that too. So even if you have a battery backup, check the time on your clock when the power comes back on. Because even if it has your schedule in there, if the time is off, it might be watering in the middle of the day. So good rule of thumb, whether you have a battery backup or not, if you lose power when it comes back on, check your control clock. And then one thing that is super important to know is that the off position on your control clock is your safe space. So anytime your sprinklers are doing something you don't want them to do, you have a broken head that's spewing water everywhere, or they're watering longer than you want or at a time you don't want and you can't figure out how to reprogram it, just turn that dial to off. Most of them have an off and then they'll have like an on or a run or an auto setting, which is where it should normally live during the season. But if you need to shut those sprinklers off, just click that to off. You do not have to completely wipe out your schedule to get it to stop doing that. Other times you might want to use that off option are when you winterize it. So when you get the sprinklers blown out for the winter, just put your clock on off. You don't need to unplug it. You don't need to wipe your schedule. Just put it on off. And then if there's ever a time that you just want to skip a watering day, maybe it rained a whole bunch the day before, or just there's some other reason that you want to skip a watering day, just put it on off. And then you'll just have to remember to put it back on run. But point being, you do not have to wipe your schedule or unplug your clock to get it to not run. And then please keep in mind that just because you have a sprinkler system doesn't mean you have to use it. So if your sprinkler system isn't working or you have a bunch of breaks that you can't get to yet, water your yard old school or by hand. I call old school where you just use a hose and a rainbow sprinkler. That's how I typically water my grass. Or you can hand water. And that's a really good idea. Even if your sprinklers are working, if you have some spots that you don't have very good coverage or a little dry, if it's a really small area, you can just hand water. And then also keep in mind that you don't have to program every zone. So even if you have 10 zones, but 2 of them you don't really care about watering, just put those run times to 0. That's how you turn individual zones off. Just put a runtime of 0 and they won't run, but you can use the rest of the system for the rest of the yard. So those are just some good tips. So we're getting down to our last slide. And I know we threw a whole bunch of information at you guys. So these are the things that I personally would like you to take most out of this is please regularly inspect your system. So especially when you turn it on at the beginning of the season, turn on every zone for a few minutes and watch the sprinklers run to make sure something didn't break over the winter or make sure things are still adjusted the way they need to be. And if things need to be adjusted or repaired, take care of those in a timely manner. Again, cycle and soak. So that's that multiple cycles with rest periods in between. you'll get much more bang for your buck out of your water and much less runoff. And then adjust your watering schedule throughout the irrigation season. So your days per week, and then if needed, your run times per zone. And keep in mind, your grass more than likely is supposed to go at least a little brown in the summer. So it's not dying. And so you don't need to have a golf course. That's personal choice. It's not wrong if you do, but you're going to have a much higher water bill if you're trying to keep that green because it's not supposed to be. All right, well, that concludes the presentation. So I think we have a whole bunch more questions.
We do. We've got lots of questions ready for you guys. First question is just about generally parts. Do you guys have a place that you would recommend getting parts from?
Yeah, great question. So most of the parts, unless you're a big time DIYer and you're making huge changes to your system, most of the parts you're going to need are going to be nozzles, changing out nozzles. You can potentially need to replace a head as well. A lot of that stuff you can get at the box stores. So Home Depot, Lowe's, a lot of that you can order online on Amazon. There is a website called Sprinkler Warehouse that and places like that really specialize in that stuff. So that would be where I would start. But certainly if you just need like one nozzle to replace, those are a few dollars, and I personally would just walk into a hardware store like Home Depot, Lowe's, Ace Hardware, something like that.
Great. On the same topic of parts, there's someone who is trying to replace some of their components, but some of them are different sizes, some of them are different fittings, and they're trying to figure out how do they know what they need without bringing the whole hardware store home to do trial and error.
Okay, I'm trying to find that question. Is there any more context on that?
Yeah, so I'll just read it for you. It
Yeah.
says, I have an old system that's been modified many times over the years. So it's a mismatch of brands, and most of the labels are worn off. So some of the components are 1/2 inch, others are 3/8 inch. When I try to replace a broken stem or nozzle, I always seem to get the wrong size or a female fitting, but I need a male fitting. So trying to figure out how do you know what you need before you get to the store?
Yeah, that's a tough one, especially if there's not a visible make and model on the head, which can happen, especially with the old stuff. And especially if, a previous homeowner did a whole bunch of DIY and they used a mishmash of parts. I don't have a simple answer for that. I will say, like Lisa mentioned, Toro brand they're very unique. They're not compatible with anything. But most other brands like Orbit, Rainbird, Hunter, if you're changing out nozzles and things like that, the huge majority of those are compatible with each other. When they talked about those different sizes, I'm wondering if perhaps they're like changing a fitting that's attaching a head to a funny pipe or something like that. Because typically you're not going to have those size ranges on the most commonly changed out parts. What I would recommend if you don't want to have to buy a whole bunch of parts to bring home and then potentially have to return them is do the opposite. If you're replacing a head or fitting, go ahead and dig it up because you're going to have to do that anyway to swap it out. Take that to the store. So take the head or the part that you're replacing to the store, and then in the store, try to do your fit of your new part, and then you can just buy the correct part. Unfortunately, there's I don't really have a better solution for that one. That one's tough.
Yeah, that was kind of a tricky situation.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question about cycle and soak. So should you use cycle and soak for drip emitter systems as well?
Great question. So typically, I would say no. It's not necessary, okay? Because drip puts out water at a much lower rate than your sprinkler heads do. And so it's not going to get ahead of the clay soil, all right? So I know we talked about in our example schedule, we had all of our zones on one schedule, one program. One thing that we actually recommend in our sprinkler evaluations is if you do have a drip zone, to put it on a second program. So most control clocks have multiple programs. Most of them have at least two. A lot of them have 3 or 4. And that is specifically for that reason. And that way you could say, for example, if you have turf grass You have 3 zones of grass, and then you have a vegetable garden, and you want to water the vegetable garden every day, and it's on a drip system, but you don't want to have to water your grass every day. You can put your grass zones on one program, like program A, and water Monday, Wednesday, Friday on cycle and soak. And then you can have your drip zone on program B, water it every day and just do one cycle. So that is specifically what those different programs are for. We did not cover that because we are going to cover that more in our second webinar in a month. But that is the best way to handle that.
Okay, great. And then when talking about cycle and soak, I know you had that slide that had the different timings of how long you should run, how long you should soak. In general, how long should the soak time be in between cycles?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for most people, doing a 2-hour increment between your cycles typically works. So in my example, I did 3 a.m., 5 a.m., and 7 a.m. So those are kind of my go-to times personally, but it will depend on how many zones you have and how long that cycle is. So in my example, my entire cycle was 42 minutes. So I basically then had, what is that, an hour and 18 minutes of soaking. Okay. That's plenty of soak. We could have crunched those cycles a little closer together. I typically like to leave at least, I would say, a minimum of a half hour of soaking from the time one cycle ends to the next one starts. But it also is depends on a number of things of like, if you have a very high precipitation rate, I would let that soak be a little bit longer to make sure we're absorbing in. Also, if your zones overlap each other a lot, so say zones 1 and 2 cover the same area, they're going to run. And so that area is going to get a whole bunch of water versus if zone 3 just is covered, it covers one area by itself. But generally speaking, soak at least 30 minutes, but soaking up to like an hour, hour and a half is perfectly acceptable too. Great
Okay,
question.
great. And speaking of like radiuses overlapping, someone is wondering, is
Hmm.
it recommended to have radius overlapping for double coverage?
I'll let Lisa get this one.
So there's something called head-to-head coverage, where basically you want water from one sprinkler to hit the next sprinkler over. So yes, you want them to basically overlap in that middle part. A lot of people think that like you just kind of want it to reach halfway, but the water at kind of at the end of, I guess I'll call the arch, there isn't a lot there. There's a lot more towards the head of the sprinkler. So that's why you kind of have cross coverage. And most sprinklers are in either like a rectangular pattern or triangular so that they can do that cross coverage. And as Nika said, sometimes there's zones that overlap, like maybe on, if you near your back fence, you have like a row that's zone 1, and then there's a row near the back of your house that's zone 2, and they both kind of cover the same patch of grass. That's pretty common as well.
Gotcha. Okay, awesome. All right, just a general question real quick. I'm not sure if we touched on this during the presentation, but could you talk about what is a funny pipe? It has a funny name.
That's
Sure.
the name of the material is funny pipe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So as far as what that's made of, I think it's some kind of polytube. So I don't know the particulars of what the actual material is, but what it is used for, it is a flexible type of piping that is used to connect a head to the lateral line to make that swing joint up. So I'm sure it has a more technical name, but it in all kinds of like irrigation circles, it's called funny pipe. Yeah.
I like that name. That's fun.
Mhm.
All right. This one's a little bit of a specific question, but asking about galvanized irrigation systems and what like the expected lifespan of a galvanized irrigation system would be. Are you all familiar with that?
I am not. So that is a bit out of our area of expertise. So that we don't install anything like that. I personally haven't experienced a galvanized irrigation system that I'm aware of. And so I can't really answer that. Yeah, but that might
Okay,
be something that you could find online. Yeah.
for sure. Yes. All
And
right.
Taylor, there is a question in here that I saw. Let me see if I can find it again about who can you hire to help set the schedule and determine how much water to use and where? So it's free, but you can have Resource Central come out and do that. So our sprinkler evaluation, that's literally what we do. We come to your house, we record your current watering schedule to get a baseline of how much you're watering. We do a visual inspection of all your zones and point out any issues we think you should address to improve your performance. We do what we call catch cup tests, where we evaluate your precipitation rate and your distribution uniformity, or how evenly the system is watering. And then we recommend a customized watering schedule. So we work with over 36 water providers along the Front Range to offer that service. So it's not literally everybody who might be on this webinar, but most folks who are joining us tonight probably are eligible. So you can sign up for that. Again, it's completely free of charge. It's paid for by your water provider. And that's at resourcecentral.org/sprinklers. You can get information and sign up for that.
Yes, and I might be a little biased, but they're pretty good at what they do. Cool. I think we have time for a few more questions before we wrap up for the night. Let's see here. Question about running drip lines and turf nozzles on the same zone. Is that possible?
Yeah, I
Lisa,
can.
go for it.
So it is not ideal. It is possible. As we talked about with hydrozones, something that's on a drip line is going to need a lot less water than turf. And if it's all in the same zone, you have to run it all for the same amount of time. So say you're watering it for half an hour, then you're watering maybe your drip a lot longer than you need to be. But, a lot of us moved into a house that already had an existing sprinkler system, or maybe you want to convert part of the zone to xeriscape. We usually recommend to convert a whole zone, but you can and I've seen it with a ton of sprinkler evaluations I've done where they have drip and turf on the same zone. So you just have to keep in mind that, if you are running that zone for a long time, maybe you need to change out the emitters for the drip line so that they're, instead of 2 gallons per hour, they're a half a gallon per hour. So they're not getting watered quite as much. So there's some kind of finagling you can do to make it work, but it is not ideal. I believe if you have the space for it in terms of on your clock and in your valves, you can split it into 2 zones, but that would require, of course, a landscaper's help. And I don't know, how much that would cost or how labor intensive it is, but that is a possibility.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Another question that's pretty relevant as we get closer and closer to spring, but what causes hammering when you first turn on in the springtime?
That's usually like water pressure, high pressure. It's that water kind of going through at intervals just because of how forceful it is. So in that case, they might have too high of water pressure. We didn't really talk about this, but there are pressure regulators that you can install. Typically, that's going to be on the valves, and that will basically reduce the pressure to a certain PSI so that it's not giving you that clangy noise.
Great. Okay. All right, let's get 2 more good ones in here. Let's see here. All right.
So, Taylor, I see one here that I feel we get a lot when we talk to people individually. What is the best sprinkler head for steep sloped yard where dogs pack the dirt down? So when you're deciding on a head type, so that's basically spray versus rotor, really what you're looking at is kind of the size and shape of the zone. And if you are installing a system from scratch, you have a lot more flexibility. Whereas if you were dealing with a pre-existing system that you effectively inherited from a previous owner. So rotors are best for larger areas and pretty evenly, like kind of regularly shaped like rectangles. Okay. Whereas spray heads, because they have a naturally shorter radius, are better for smaller areas or irregularly shaped areas. So that's the good rule of thumb for that. That the size and the shape of the zone is a better factor for determining what head type to use as opposed to whether it's a sloped yard or not.
I can add a little bit to that, Nika.
Mhm.
If the area has spray heads and you're choosing between standard nozzles and the rotary, there is some evidence that the rotary nozzles are a little bit better just because
Yes.
they lead to less runoff. And with a slope, you're going to naturally get a lot of runoff. So not that you have to, but potentially it'd be a better option if you have those high efficiency rotary nozzles, if you have the pop-up spray heads.
Great. Okay, this is going to be our last question for tonight. Thank you all for getting your questions in. Sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but is there an easy way to tell or early warning signs that would indicate that a drip line is torn or that your system in general is leaking?
I'm glad you picked this one. Taylor.
Good choice.
Yeah, good choice. Lisa, do you want to do that one?
Sure. So there's usually it's going to be more of an indirect sign that there's a leak. Sometimes you'll have an obvious geyser, and basically the way you see that is turn the zone on and see the geyser. But more often it's going to be indirect, like you have really low water pressure. So like your heads aren't popping up all the way, or they pop up, but they barely spray out any water, especially if that's only happening in one zone. If you have low pressure everywhere, then it would affect every zone turned on. But if you have a leak on, say, zone 4 and your heads don't pop up there, usually that's a sign. Another thing you can kind of try is, where the lateral lines run between your heads. Of course, we don't all have X-ray vision, but sometimes it's obvious where those pipes are going to be. You can kind of walk the length of those pipes and see, does it feel really squishy? Does it feel like a water bed that I'm walking on? Because then it might indicate that there's a crack or a break somewhere. As far as drip lines, that's a little trickier. I would just say make sure you inspect your drip line every now and again, because especially like if you have high pressure, sometimes nozzles can fly off. Yep. And then you get like a little mini geyser, or dogs or rabbits chew up your drip, or if your plants are dying. So if you have a plant, especially if it's only one or a couple of them that look really sad and all the other ones look good, then you probably have a spaghetti line that got cut or something. So just my advice would be regularly do a visual inspection. Nika mentioned like once a month, turn each zone on for a couple minutes, see if you see any obvious signs of water shooting up, or just anything that looks funky. And if you need anything repaired, people often ask us, we don't do repairs here at our organization, and we can't recommend specific companies, but we do like to direct people to the Associated Landscape Contractors of Colorado. That's alcc.com. There you can find kind of trustworthy and certified professionals if you need someone to help you with a repair.
Great, and I will add on to some comments about if your drip line is broken. So usually with drip, what we'll see is one of two issues. Either an emitter is missing, has popped off or been ripped off or something like that. And that will literally form like a little like quarter-inch wide jet of water that it'll shoot like 10 feet in the air if it's pointed in that direction. The other thing that I have seen, which is actually more obvious a lot of times, is if that main poly tube, that main line of your drip sometimes those will kind of get slashed, they'll get a gash in them. And usually those you're going to hear, or if it's like in a corner or it is buried under mulch, you're going to hear it. You can actually hear it sounds like water gushing, or if it's in a more visible spot, you will see it. And those are pretty darn obvious when it's that main line of the drip that's broken. But again, like that's why we say do your visual inspections, because normally you're running your sprinklers when you're asleep. So you're not going to see that. But especially with the drip, what I have seen when it is that main line, it basically clears all the mulch from around it. So you'll walk out and see like a bare patch where you used to have mulch and now you don't. And so that can also be a sign that your drip line had got a gash in it. Great question.
Lots of good indicators there. So thank you guys. Lisa, Nika, anything else you'd like to add before we close out for the night?
Just thank you everybody for joining us. We appreciate you spending the evening with us. And if you would like to see if you're eligible for one of our free sprinkler evaluations, please go to resourcecentral.org/sprinklers. And we hope to see you this summer.